Welcome back to the Whence podcast. This is episode number 638. I want to thank all of the contributors, fellows, legacy partners, and supporters, producers of the WCY podcast. You guys make it happen. I want to say thank you so much. And if you're curious on how to support the show, head on over to WCYpodcast.com, click on support the show. With that out of the way, there are a number of things that I cover each week. Presentation schedules, things happening in Masonry, news, all that stuff. But we got some news in this last week, and it seemed to stop so many of us in our tracks. You've likely noted the title of the show, and it's kind of surreal. Imagine doing a podcast in a day and age where Albert Mackey dies, or William Preston dies. Well-known servants of the craft. And that's kind of what happened with Kevin. Brother Kevin Townley passed away recently, and the first thing I thought to do was to reach out to one of his best friends, who's also one of our best friends and a contributor to this show, Worshipful Brother Patrick Dey. He and Kevin were super close friends, and you'll hear all about that coming up. But before I go into Patrick's encomium of Kevin Townley, I wanted to share just a few things about Kevin that I was able to experience. Perhaps my closest friend came out of Denver Lodge, and we met I can't even tell you when we met or why we met. Very strange. It turned out that he and I, Brother Scott Duball, Worshipful Brother Scott Duball, and I were at the same conferences years before we even said hi to each other. He has pictures of a conference in which I'm in the background. After Scott and I became close friends, I would hear tales about the educational and philosophical, spiritual efforts of Masonry in Colorado. And this was unheard of. It was a sort of advocating of something that could work here too. And amongst those legends of what was happening in Colorado came the stories of a man named Kevin Townley. And before I ever met Kevin, I had known that he had been the republisher of Bromwell's work, Restorations of Masonic Geometry. And of course, I bought a copy. I bought 2 copies, one for me and one for a buddy. A phenomenal book. And then a couple of years later, I end up speaking at an educational day in Denver, Colorado, or somewhere in Colorado, and it was a multi-track event. Brother Patrick Dey was speaking that day. I was speaking. Anyway, my memory's a bit fuzzy on the day, but I do remember Kevin Townley sitting in my presentation, Esoterics 101, something that's one of my more wild presentations, and he provided such insight, but only when I asked for it. That's how he was. He didn't come up to me and say, I came up to him to say, hey, you're Kevin Townley. I hear so much about you. I bought the book on Bromwell, and we got to talking, and it turned out that, we were both members of BOTA, or Builders of the Addendum, or Addendum. Kevin had completed the entire 14-year course, plus some, and he wrote 2 books, and you'll hear about those from Worshipful Brother Patrick Dey, Cube of Space and Meditations on the Cube of Space. And then we parted ways. Scott and I flew back home, and we chartered a lodge a few years down the line, Space Novum 1183, where I am currently the master. But for our first 2 years, we needed a charter master and a first-year master, and Scott Duball served both of those for us. And he was able to secure Kevin Townley to come out and do our talk at our annual Feast of St. Andrew, which happened on November 30th. At the conclusion of this podcast, we'll forego the usual music, and instead, I will play the recording that I had November 30th, 2019. I don't think I'm going to edit the recording at all. You can listen to it. It's just a few minutes. It is at the end of our festive board when we do Auld Lang Syne, or Auld Lang Syne. There are some comments that are made before we sing, and in it, you'll hear our worshipful master being given a gift. You'll hear Kevin Townley laugh And you'll hear his voice while singing too. I record Auld Lang Syne every year we do it, and it just so happened that that particular year I had Kevin Townley there. So wanted to share that with all of you, and previously who had only been shared with, a very select number of individuals who happened to be there that evening rather. And so I could go on about what Kevin's done, but I think Worshipful Brother Dey does a much better job than I do. And sit back and listen to this because it's really inspiring.
On October 8th, 1952, 112 people died in a train crash in Wealdstone, England. And on the other side of the Atlantic, a boy was born in Middleton, New York. Kevin Thomas Townley might have been one of the greatest men and Masons his generation has known, and certainly one of the greatest I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. The announcement of his passing at 4:26 a.m. in Denver, Colorado on May 25th, 2024, is a harsh reality that many are still not accepting. Right now, 2 days since his passing, I am looking at the M2 groupable database for Kevin, and 9 different lodges have the ability to update his profile as deceased, but none of us lodge secretaries have updated it. It is as if we don't want it to be true. I am currently the one updating his profile, and it grieves me to no end to be the one to do it. Right now, as I am writing this encomium, I bear the sad duty of being the one to update his Maury profile as deceased. So forever will the database bear my pessimistic name as the one who had to admit the sad truth, that the great Kevin Townley is no more. And once more I cry for his passing. On Saturday, May 25th, 2024, shortly after 5 a.m., my phone started to ring. It was from Greg Harris, the Grand Chaplain of the Grand Lodge of Colorado. My wife asked who it was, and I said Egg, as that was my nickname for him. My wife said, "It's 5 in the morning, you know it can't be good. Answer his call." So I did. Greg is more than a brother to me, he is a friend. Nay, he's my best friend. He was my best man at my wedding, the same wedding that Kevin Townley officiated. And Greg might have been one of, if not the closest Masonic friends to Kevin Townley. And speaking with Greg about it later that day, he said, "I had to call my best friend and let him know that we lost our other one." Anyway, I heard over the phone line Greg say in a choked voice those solemn and tragic words, "Kevin Townley died." It must have been akin to that moment in Plutarch's Moralia, where he tells of a ship that came near to the shores of Pelotes, where the steersman Thamos exclaimed, "The great god Pan is dead," and from the shores he heard many great and thunderous lamentations. That was what it was like for me in that moment over the phone. The great Kevin Townley was dead. I rolled out of bed, stumbled to the porch, and proceeded to chain smoke cigarettes and cry for a long while. I know Kevin impacted many men and Masons' lives, but he was close to me. I learned much from him. He shared and showed me many things. We did so much ritual together. We shared many sacred experiences together. We had so many conversations together that I will never forget. He was a pivotal point in my life, and now I must concede that the great Kevin Townley is dead. Kevin Townley was born on October 8th, 1952. He joined the Merchant Marines on December 18th, 1978, and his term ended as such on June 1st, 1984. I myself was not even born yet. I believe it was while he was in the Merchant Marines that he was introduced to the art and culture of Central Asia. Something Kevin did for many years was that he would go to Pakistan and India, and he would buy numerous cultural items and works of craftsmanship and bring them back to the States to sell. Kind of like his own private import business. He came to Colorado shortly after the Merchant Marines, where he worked in construction. Kevin, at first glance, did not seem like the type, but really, when you got to know him, you knew he could deck you if he needed to. He was a big guy. I put on weight during my wife's first pregnancy with our first son, sympathetic weight. And I told Kevin about it, and he laughed and patted his belly and said, "Same, and I can never lose it." But he could move weight all those years in construction. Kevin was one of the few people who were instrumental in making sure the annual communication of the Grand Lodge of Colorado went off without a hitch every year. To watch Kevin load and unload the truck every year was a sight to behold. I one time asked him if he needed help, and he said, "Not if you value your well-being," as he moved this huge altar all by himself. And to drive the point home of how much of a badass he was, he drove himself to the hospital after he had his heart attack. He had a heart attack on the morning of May 24th. Actually, he had a heart attack the month before, and he recovered well enough to resume his usual duties as Grand Lecturer after only a couple of days. But he had a heart attack in the morning and drove himself from Niwot to Longmont, and when they assessed him there, they flew him to St. Anthony's Hospital in Denver. So he drove himself to the hospital after having a heart attack. Part of me is not surprised by that at all. One thing that always resonated between me and Kevin on why we became Masons was that we read a lot of the same stuff. Once while I was chatting with him, he said the reason he became a Mason was because he realized that much of what he was reading either ended up discussing Masonry at some point or was actually written by a Mason. So he said to himself, there must be something about this Masonry stuff. And I felt kind of the same way when I became a Mason. And so Kevin was made a Mason at Boulder Lodge number 45 in 1994. Boulder Lodge would merge with Columbia 14 in 2018. So it is that I will always value the fact that he and I share a mother lodge, even though our mother lodge is technically extinct. In fact, he was my first Worshipful master when I became a Mason. And I will never forget the first meeting after I was made a Mason. I didn't have a car at the time, and I actually resided in Denver. And I took the bus to Boulder for my first few meetings. And we had just come back from dark, and Kevin was adamant that education should be done at every meeting, no matter how short. He thought this education this one night would be short and sweet, but I was really getting into everything he was going on about, and so the education actually got drawn out and made for a very late night. He was talking about the magic squares of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, which respectively have 9, 16, and 25 squares. But then he started to pull from his book, The Cube of Space, and begins to discuss these magic squares when they're extruded into cubes. And I found this fascinating, so I started to do the math in my head real quick, and I realized that 3 cubed plus 4 cubed plus 5 cubed equals 216, or 6 times 6 times 6. And I asked him about this, and he said, "Whew boy, we have some things to talk about, you and I." By the way, that book, Cube of Space, is phenomenal. He did a follow-up book, Meditations on the Cube of Space, but the first one is key. Basically, Kevin took a BOTA course, the Builders of the Adytum, a course on the Kabbalistic Cube of Space, but it was very short and not very in-depth. And Kevin realized more potential to this subject and set about to write 2 books to fully unpack the Cube of Space, far beyond what was a basic outline written by Paul Foster Case. I am not sure how easily one can procure that book now that Kevin has passed. He used to just keep a box of copies in his trunk, and if you wanted one, it was $20. He would only sell them directly. Apparently he got screwed over by a publishing partner or something years ago, and so he would only sell them direct from himself. And it looks like these are still going for a couple $100 on Amazon Marketplace and eBay. So if you have a copy, cherish it. One reason why Cube of Space holds such a special place for me is because it helped me properly select my signifier card when doing tarot readings. Now, tarot is not my preferred method of divination. I much prefer geomancy, but tarot still works for me. Anyway, I was telling Kevin about someone I knew who used a major arcana card for his signifier, and I said that feels audacious. And Kevin agreed, and he said that the major arcana are signifiers of divine influence. So to use one to represent yourself takes that card out of the reading. And it may be something that the divine is trying to communicate, but you told the divine that the divine can't use this card. You might as well throw out any card you don't like in that case. And I told him that I had been using the Knight of Cups, but I still felt that was a little too bold because royal cards are still very significant, and therefore you're removing that from the reading. And Kevin agreed, and he said, Patrick, go back through Cube of Space. And based on the decan of your birth, you can pick your card that way, and it will be a pip card. He's referring to figure 9 on page 97. That's a way to pick your signifier card based on the decan or one of, rulers of the zodiacs over your birth. Mine's the 8 of Wands, by the way. Anyway, there's a little pro tip for you on how you may switch up your tarot reading game straight from Kevin Townley himself. For me, the most important publishing venture of Kevin's was in 2010 when he republished Henry P.H. Bromwell's Restoration of Masonic Geometry. Again, it's a phenomenal text. Kevin was actually the guy who introduced me to Bromwell. For the last 4 years, I have been engaged in an immense amount of research on Bromwell in all aspects of him and his work and his life. His poetry, his political speeches, his Masonic essays, his personal life, the ritual of Bromwell's Rite of Free and Accepted Architects, which I've been deciphering for some time. The copy of this ritual I actually got from Kevin. Years of my personal research and fascination around Bromwell all started because of Kevin. And I think anyone who knew Kevin could say something to that effect. I would not be doing X if it were not for Kevin. I would not be studying Y if it were not for Kevin. I would not have gotten to where I am in Masonry if it were not for Kevin. One thing that is of no surprise to me, though it warms my heart nonetheless, is that after Kevin's death was announced, the number of people on Facebook and in emails and across the airwaves, Freemasons and even non-Masons, telling about how Kevin influenced their life. He was just that kind of guy. And Kevin was so much more than a Mason. He is predominantly known in Masonry, but he is known outside of the lodge rooms. As I mentioned, he was in Builders of the Adytum. He was also, I think he was in Amorc, I think. It was some non-Masonic Rosicrucian order, or at least he was close with people in that group. Kevin was also a very private guy, so to know much about anything in his personal life meant that he and you were close and he confided in you. He was also a Masonic Rosicrucian. He helped form the Masonic Legacy Society. Yeah, we should probably knock out his Masonic career real quick. So, Kevin was made a Mason on March 16th, passed August 19th, raised October 19th, and declared proficient as a Master Mason on December 17th, 1994, in Boulder Lodge number 45 in Boulder, Colorado. He received all the capitular degrees of the York Rite on November 12th, 1999, and I guess the Royal and Select Master degrees on the same day. And the following day, he received the Super Excellent Master degree and the Commandery orders. That must have been a hell of a festival. If I can remember his York Rite affiliations appropriately, he was made a Royal Arch Mason in Keystone Chapter number 7, a Cryptic Mason in Boulder Council number 17, and a Knight Templar in Flatirons Commandery number 7 in Boulder, Colorado. Now, these would eventually merge and whatnot with like Longmont and Greeley and whatnot, and they now reside in Lafayette, Colorado. So today they are Keystone Chapter number 8, Hiram Council number 7, and Flatirons Commandery number 7. He was in the Scottish Rite, the Denver Consistory, but I do not have his record on hand. I also know that at one time he was a Shriner, but he demitted years ago. He was also a Knight Mason at Kincor Council number 8. He was not very active with any of these. He dedicated much of his energy to Blue Lodge and the Grand Lodge of Colorado. I want to clarify because many people took Kevin's insistence on Blue Lodge coming first and his lack of participation in the Scottish and York Rites to mean that he hated the Scottish and York Rites. He didn't. He just firmly believed that Blue Lodge came first and he practiced what he preached. He told me years ago that he was inspired by Bromwell, who says that there are 3 degrees and no more. Kevin took that to heart since he was so active in his various Blue Lodges and the Grand Lodge Colorado, he really didn't have a lot of time to do anything else. However, he was very active in Colorado College, SRICF, Masonic Rosicrucians, until very recently he stepped back. He received the 1st through 3rd grades on November 26, 2010, the 4th grade on February 4th, 2011. We have a gap in his record for the 5th through 7th grades, but he received the 8th grade on December 16th, 2016, and the 9th grade on November 4th, 2022. I should note that that's an accomplishment. Few will ever receive the 8th grade, and even fewer receive the 9th grade. Before he stepped down, he had served as several ancients, the exponent, and resigned while he was celebrant. His Latin motto was Omnia ad Deo Gloriam, all to the glory of God. And that is not even getting into all his offices. I don't know when he first became Master of Boulder Lodge. I know it was within the first few years of being made a Mason, and the following year he became Secretary. So I think that was around like 1997 or 1998, because he said he would only serve as Secretary for 25 years, but that mark came last year, and he was still Secretary when he died. He was actually the person who inspired me to set a term limit for myself as Secretary of my lodge. Anyway, he served as Secretary of 3 lodges and was a custodian of the work of the Grand Lodge Colorado. He had also been Grand Orator and died serving as the Grand Lecturer. Kevin was a mentor, a teacher, and an advocate in Masonry and the esoteric sciences. And so now I really want to discuss Kevin as an alchemist. Many of us esoteric Masons have read a bit of alchemy and maybe have done an operation or two, and then we think that makes us an expert on the subject, but Kevin was an actual alchemist. As he told me, he and a small group of other alchemists basically had the patronage of some wealthy dude. I don't know all the details, but imagine that. Imagine being basically a paid alchemist. For years, Kevin practiced alchemy for hours every day. Actually, I heard one time he accidentally practically blew up the laboratory he and the other guys worked in. He even taught alchemy at Naropa College in Boulder. Again, this is something he told me. I keep saying this is what Kevin told me because I just want to be clear and on the record that this is what I know about him from what I heard from Kevin himself. Last year, a friend of Kevin's in California, who was a chemist and an alchemist, was getting rid of like a ton of his chemistry paraphernalia. Beakers, condensers, burners, pelicans, loads and loads of alchemical and chemical paraphernalia. Kevin showed me pictures of all of it, and he was giddy like a child at Christmas. So he went out to California, packed it all up into cases, and then loaded it all into a box truck and drove it back to Colorado. And he actually got pulled over on the drive, and when the cop asked to see what was in the back, Kevin said, chemistry paraphernalia, I'm an alchemist. And the cop got on his radio and said, I'm going to need backup and a K9 unit. As sketchy as it looked, everything was legal and above board, so he was let go. Anyway, Kevin was actually an expert on alchemy, but he paid for it with his physical health. He eventually developed complications from heavy metal poisoning, and he spent years in physical therapy and detox of mercury and lead and antimonium. Since that time, he had to largely focus on the theoretical and spiritual aspects of alchemy, and his physical experiments were largely confined to organics, plant fermentation, etc. He actually used to make his own absinthe long before it was legalized in the US. He said he still had some, and I wish I had been more convincing when I asked to buy some off of him, but he refused. He also was a bit of a moonshine connoisseur. I remember him and I and Greg Harris hanging out in Louisville, Kentucky at High Council in 2022. A few of the colleges had their own hospitality suites, so we went hospitality suite hopping. And let me tell you, those Kentucky guys know how to stock a bar. I noticed a mason jar of clear liquid, and I knew exactly what it was. Having grown up in South Carolina, I shook it up to examine the bubbles, tried it, and I must admit that might have been some of the finest moonshine I've ever had, or at least it's close and running to the White Lightning my buddy Cosmic makes. Anyway, sipping it, Kevin asked me what it was, and Kevin didn't drink often, but he drank. But he wanted to try some of that Kentucky Mountain Dew, and I was amazed at his commentary when he compared it to how he used to make it. Perhaps my favorite kind of drinking time with Kevin was my bachelor party, and the word party is in air quotes. We got an Airbnb for overflow guests, and but it was pretty much just me and Kevin and the maid of honor's sister staying at the house. So me and Kevin just hung out on the back patio and talked about the occult and esoteric matters while drinking some scotch. And then the next morning, at the moment of the autumnal equinox, Kevin officiated the marriage of myself and my wife, Selah. I guess I haven't mentioned Kevin's humor, but he pretty much looked like a beardless Santa Claus. He even had that sort of ho, ho, ho sort of laugh. Anyway, when it got to the moment of should there be anyone who opposes the union of this man and woman, speak now or forever hold your peace, Kevin then suddenly goes, yes, you, sir, in the back. Everyone got a good chuckle out of it. The first time I got to know Kevin's sense of humor was when I first met him. The guy who got me into Masonry drove me up to Boulder, and Kevin showed me around the Masonic hall there. Walking through the lodge room, he started to expound upon, some of the significance of each and everything in the room. And I asked him if the carpet in the lodge room was blue because of the Blue Lodge, and he said, "Nah, I think that's just because we got a good deal on it if we pick this color." I think that's something that gets lost about Kevin. Many knew him as, an esoteric and Masonic lecturer. So we tend to take him as being very serious, and therefore we take him very seriously. But on a personal level, he was actually really funny. And he had many very human qualities, such as he liked fishing. He liked to fish on his kayak, but he had not gotten on his kayak in a number of years, so he actually gave the kayak to my wife. He played banjo, and exceedingly well, I will add. He had an incredible voice when he sang bluegrass songs and while playing banjo. Actually, he liked to break out into song randomly sometimes. But at the same time, he also had a very powerful ecclesiastical Latin singing voice. Oh yeah, that's another thing about Kevin. He studied from a young age to be a Carmelite monk. I think when he was 13 years old is when he began his studies in a Carmelite monastery. But again, don't let that fact convince you that he wasn't a rambunctious teenager. Here's a fun story. While in seminary, Kevin was probably 14 or 15, and this is old school, but the monastery had one of those milk dispensers where there was like this 5-gallon bladder of milk, and you drew milk as you needed from that bladder. One day, Kevin emptied the bladder, replaced it with a new bladder of milk, and then took the empty bladder, filled it with water, and carried it up to like a high parapet or a high window and threw it over to watch it go sploosh. Below, at that exact moment, Kevin dropped the bladder. Out of the door below walked the priest, and the bladder just barely missed him. And the priest looked up to see Kevin peering above him, realizing that he was in so much trouble. That might be one of my favorite stories of Kevin. He was so many things. It would be impossible to name them all. But of all his accomplishments and all his titles and everything he did, I just think there's one final thing to bring up, and that he was a husband and a father. He had 2 sons from a previous marriage, Kevin and Sean. Many of us had long known Nancy and maybe even met her, his partner, for many, many years. And in 2023, they finally married. I doubt Nancy's listening, but if you are, Nancy, we love you and we're here for you, and that our hearts are continuously with you. Now, this coming Thursday, June 6th at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, the Grand Lodge of Colorado will conduct the final rites for Kevin at the Denver Scottish Rite Consistory. If you are in town, please come and commemorate Kevin's life with us as a concluding token of our love and admiration for him. And if you are not in town, but want to celebrate him with us in your own way, feel free to observe with us in your own way at that time and date. I want to say that it has been really difficult for me to write this, much less record it. It took a while for me to approach this with a Nietzschean coldness, but know that often I had to stop and cry. or simply cry while writing these words. My memories of Kevin are dear to me, and I cherish them. I share this with my wife, who also held Kevin with a certain fondness. She actually once asked him to be her mentor, and he said, "No, I'm way too busy. I would not be suitable for what you need." And she respected that, but when I shared this with her, she started to tear up as well, remembering her own fond memories of Kevin. And that is the power that he had. But know that I have still now not stopped crying for him, for the mourners go about the streets. So to conclude, I want to point out why I decided to do this whole tribute as an encomium. Sometimes that word is used as a fancy synonym for obituary or eulogy or whatever, a mere exercise in using the thesaurus, but encomium literally means to revel within etymologically. It is meant to be a celebration of one's life. I could have kept all of this less personal, keeping out all the personal anecdotes, and just stuck with giving a basic resume of his life's facts and accomplishments, but I wanted to personally share my time and experiences with Kevin Townley because I am sure that so many of you have stories about him, fond memories, moments where he has influenced and impacted you, and I want you to reflect on them. And when you're done reflecting, share them. Share the great memories you have of Kevin Townley and make sure that his name echoes throughout the Masonic world for ages upon ages to come. Let our love and admiration of everything he has done for us and for Masonry never be forgotten. The great Kevin Townley's dead, but he is alive in our hearts and in the heart of Masonry, and therein he will never, no never die. So here's to Kevin Townley, in hopes that his mind comprehended all that he needed to know, and that his body experienced everything it was meant to experience before he expired, and that his grand, strange spirit rests sweetly and brilliantly beyond the threshold of that tropical gate in the heavens. Well done, good and faithful servant. Rest now in the joy of thy Lord. So by request for the Whence Came You podcast, this has been Patrick Dey, and this has been my encomium for Kevin Townley. I love you, Kevin, and I'll never forget you.
Well, there it is. The great Kevin Townley graduated from this world to the next. And thank you from everyone at Space Novum, and thank you on behalf of everyone. That's it, everybody. Enjoy the recording.
A circle kind of around the room and give your attention to Right Worshipful Brother. Yeah. Please, my dad's Right Worshipful Brother. But as much as it's admirable to be the point within the circle. So, brother, before we finish up tonight with what's in the back of the card and I explain, I have one little presentation I wish to do. And this is on behalf of the Brother of Space Novum, the guys who are brothers of this lodge and have been with us and working on the chartering and the dispensation process and everything that's gone into essentially getting to this point tonight. Understand that there have been a number of individuals who have worked incredibly hard and have had an awful lot of vision to bring us to where we are. And one of those guys in particular, probably no vision, has been stronger or more well articulated than that of our master, stop pointing to RJ, than that of our worshipful master, Scott Duvall. And so I wanted to present you with a little something from all of us at the lodge to thank you for your dedication, your vision, the insane amount of hours and sweat and maybe tears. I don't know if you cried, it's cool. That you put into this. So just thank you for everything.
Thanks, bro.
There's part of a story that I will elaborate on one aspect of it.
I got permission to take pictures and send it back.
No, Jim.
Chinese. That would be a grant.
Right now.
Chinese. That would be a grant.
Yeah.
I promise I washed that box. Okay, who's telling the jokes here? So One of the items in the box is a antique square, an ebony and brass inlaid square, which as master is fitting an appropriate tool of his office. The little block that you're holding in your other hand is something that allows you to stick the blade into it and essentially stand it upright on the desk. The very far... Yeah. Well, you could do it that way, or the way that I made it was this way, and it will self-balance then. Or, do whatever you want. I'm sure it balances other ways. But I think it's pretty fitting for masters to actually have the real working tool that they have, and I'm a big proponent of actually having physical working tools and using those as part of meditation or other thoughts about the craft. I think everybody should have or endeavor to have, not some little wooden trinket or a tiny whatever in a box, but real physical tools. And as a tool collector, and as I know you are a fellow woodworker, it's a pleasure to pass this on to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Spence, and thank you, brothers. Appreciate it.
And there's one other tiny thing in the box.
Oh, yes.
So there is, right now, a very beautiful bottle of scotch trapped somewhere on a third-party shipping van between Colorado and here. As soon as they get their heads out of their asses and it shows up here,
Wonderful. It will not be this. It's not this.
No, that's just a placeholder.
Thank you.
Symbolic.
Thank you, guys. Anyone that knows of a desk I can put the square on, I'm currently looking for a desk, so in full employment.
I need a PA, but I can only pay you $10 an hour.
It's not minimum wage.
We'll
work something out.
Okay.
So finally, brethren, the last thing we wanted to do tonight, if you look on the back of your place cards, you may have seen some lyrics that seem relatively familiar, some which may be more familiar than others. These are the lyrics to a relatively well-known song that we know as Auld Lang Syne. The lyrics were put together and written down to music by our brother Robert Burns in the year 1788. Burns was an interesting dude, and the poetry that he put together for this is not necessarily of his own composition. It was kind of picked and chosen from various other oral, musical, and folk traditions that he kind of put together and synthesized, as well as the music, the tune that we've all undoubtedly heard for this tune in New Year's Eve and various movies and pop culture things, which has been used by the likes of Beethoven, for example, for doing various symphonic and composition works. Is again something from an oral tradition that he picked up and he put together with this music. One of his big deals was saving a lot of the oral tradition of music and folk music, especially in Scotland and the British Isles. And one of the ways that he chose to do that was selecting these pastoral tunes, these melodies, which maybe the average person wouldn't be able to literally write down or look at in a music fashion, but could certainly associate to a poem or some words and turn it into a song that could be sung and therefore remembered. And you wind up kind of killing two birds with one stone. You have a pastoral lesson or song, in many cases an ode, a story, that winds up being remembered through music, and the music is remembered through the story. Auld Lang Syne, this is kind of a slight anglicization of the traditional Scottish dialect put through here, but it's an interesting sentiment that's portrayed here. We sing this or we hear this all the time, and what are we really talking about? Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and Auld Lang Syne? The idea of Auld Lang Syne literally translates to be old long since, or a time past, essentially something before this time. Would our acquaintances and would all of us in this room forget each other and the experiences that we've had here tomorrow? Would we forget it in a week, in a month, in a lifetime? Probably not. I know I won't. And part of the idea of singing this song at ideas like New Year's or other important festivals is that idea of remembering and the idea of christening, that we have done something here tonight that was remarkable, and that those of us in this room are now bound together in friendship and brotherhood beyond what we could have been otherwise. So I would like to lead us in a singing of this song. I've brought a whistle, which I'll play around with. I tried to pick a good key that hopefully men's voices will fit with. And we're also going to go through it at a reasonable pace. Sometimes this gets really dirge-like and it's kind of, but it's not a sad song, really. So let's give it a shot. So those will be, sorry. Good, you can start. Just an idea of key.
Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old
We'll see you next week, Betsy.
Some of you will see sooner than that, yes.